So this topic basically was inspired more or less by Chiara, and she asked me a few months ago to look at eBay. So of course, many of us who are in the archaeology and sort of heritage world know eBay as a platform where, well, obviously you can sell anything, but certainly you can sell a lot of archaeological and kind of cultural heritage objects. So we wanted to take a look at how basically eBay could maybe inform us, not necessarily in a negative way, but inform us about other patterns. For instance, can we get a sense of what people want in terms of cultural heritage to purchase as a kind of barometer, if you will, of the larger antiquities and cultural heritage market, whether it's the legal or illegal market. So eBay, of course, is a kind of mass media platform in the fact that people all around the world can sell pretty much anything, particularly the US site of eBay, which is generally international. So this was a project I think that was challenging because as you'll see in a second, eBay is both a structured kind of data set, but it's also an unstructured data set. And that presents a number of challenges trying to get relevant and useful information about how antiquities are sold or cultural heritage objects as well, and trying to get something useful in terms of what it's telling us about how the past, the physical past, is used or valued by different people. Okay, so the problem is, as I stated, is basically knowing patterns of where antiquities are sold, what type of antiquities are being sold, but also the cultures they represent, trying to sort of classify the cultural interests that happen with regards to the past on eBay, and what they can tell us about the monetary side, but also what people actually value in terms of what they are interested in. So those are the kinds of insights we were trying to gain, including, of course, maybe one sort of side question was the interest if we can use eBay to get a sense of the illegal antiquities market. Can it be a kind of barometer, if you will, on wider interests that are happening, particularly with news events, with looting and those kinds of things? Can we use a site like eBay to get a sense of wider interests? Now, as I mentioned, the problem is when you look at eBay, it's basically a site that presents you with very structured information, so you can get information about locality, of course, price. The sale price is pretty easy to get, but information such as descriptions of what's being sold is a bit more tricky. If you think about descriptions, they can be problematic. People don't always know what they're actually selling. They're quite sometimes very descriptive in detail. Other times you get all kinds of spellings about information that's being sold. So we use a variety of methods. One of it is called named entity recognition. It's a form of natural language processing, which tries to effectively classify human language in some kind of useful or meaningful categorization. So it's both subjective, but also applies some knowledge that researchers bring to effectively try to make sense of a wider body of a large random set of textual data. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We also use dictionaries effectively, word dictionaries, to also sort of supplement some of that approach. So the results I'll be presenting will look at things like country level patterns. What are the sales patterns that we can see at different countries around the world? What do they care about effectively in terms of sales? Which sort of answers some of the questions I present, but not completely, but I'll talk about that. And look at the cultures that are in demand, the objects of purchase, and the relationships between cultures and objects. What cultures are interested and what kind of objects are actually being sold on eBay. And I'll look at the methods and maybe perhaps some of the impacts these have in a wider sense. So looking at the methods in a little bit more detail, what happened here is similar to the presentation Richard actually presented. I first looked at the API, and that was quite actually hard to use. It wasn't very easy. So we ended up doing a kind of a slight hack by finding a site that could give us some historical eBay data from a few months back, and continuously scraping the site until pretty much about a few days ago I stopped work. And so that sort of archive becomes our textual body. We covered the period from around October till April of this year. The next thing was applying these algorithms that I'll talk about in a second, and then applying some dictionary matching, and then of course statistical analyses and mapping of the data to try to make sense of what's happening with a larger body of information. So the NER approach, the named entity recognition approach, is basically a method to classify that information in some understandable way, supplemented by these dictionary methods that I mentioned. So if you go to eBay's sort of historical data site, where you can get information about what's been sold, you sort of present with this page where you get a kind of picture of the object, you get a short description, and of course the cost. So some of that information, as I mentioned, is structured, so that information such as cost and also sometimes location of where the object was sold from is pretty easy to get. The unstructured bit, of course, is that description where you don't necessarily know what periods, what cultures, what type of object even is being sold. And also things like materiality. What kind of object? Is it metal? Is it glass? Those things are not easy to sort of distinguish from what's given. So this is a more detailed view of the once you click in on the site of the object sold, you can get a more sort of detailed description of the object, and you can see some of that that structured and unstructured data, the locality, the sale price, but of course description being a somewhat unstructured data set. So the other method that we use, or one of the methods that we use, I should say, is this dictionary approach. Dictionaries are useful in that they tell you, obviously, specific words that you can look for in a data set. Now, of course, there's going to be problems with that. Dictionaries you have a specific term, and then you can sort of generalize those terms to more categories that might allow you to aggregate data. So, for instance, think of vessels, different types of pottery vessels. There are different forms of that: vases, pitchers, lanterns. Those kinds of things are all types of vessels, or even cultures like Roman. You can say Roman, of course, but there are other sort of subcultures within, the Roman Empire. Same thing with Egyptians, other cultures, and other types of objects. So metals, for instance, can be, of course, a large variety of objects. So in this dictionary approach, it's useful in that it allows you to aggregate larger data into some meaningful category. But you may notice very quickly you get a problem in that human language tends to be very ambiguous. So think of Iron Age. If you scrape that information and try to analyze it, you may think iron is referring to a metal, but it's also referring to a period when it's used with age, so Iron Age. So those kinds of ambiguities begin to pop up, and of course that can cause kind of misunderstanding of your data, what's really happening in terms of the cultures being sold. So in terms of the data sets, there was roughly about 120 terms, 45 categories that were used in the 50+ thousand sales that we're able to scrape between October and April of this year that relate to antiquities. So about, I think, 54,000 in total was the final data set. So the other method, because of this problems you have with dictionaries, where you get a lot of ambiguous terms and you can make a lot of bad interpretations, basically, is that we use another method called named entity recognition. This is where you use natural language processing, effectively a methodology to understand human language using computational methods. It's a machine learning approach to use context of text to get a better idea of meaning of terms. So a classical approach might be looking at, say, people, organizations, different types of countries, and you can apply an approach that use a supervised classification. So you basically teach the computer that, say, Trump, Donald Trump, is a person. And words that precede Trump may reflect the fact that you're referring to Trump, the person, or Trump, let's say, a building, a name of a building. So you can effectively use the context around a term to teach the algorithm that you're effectively referring to a specific type of thing that you categorize. So a person, an object, a place, whatever it might be. So name entity recognition, or NER, just to make it easier, is a way effectively to better contextualize that information so we could avoid some of the ambiguous results you might get when you apply classical dictionary or gazetteer, as they're sometimes called, approaches. So this is another kind of way, so you can begin to classify these, so people become more classified. So President Trump, if the term president precedes Trump, you know, very likely to have a person being referenced in that case. So using that context, the location of the terms around the primary term you're interested in allows you to identify how you categorize a specific term effectively. So if we think of things like this, let's say you're looking just bored of lots of information. What NER does is basically look at, say, key terms. So think of prepositions like to. They often precede pronouns or nouns and other verbs as well. And that allows you to basically then use that idea, that the fact that you have prepositions or other forms of parts of speech that can then tell you what a specific term you might be interested in, say race in this case. So think of text sentences as effectively networks, or rather graphs of words. that have relationships to each other. And these graphs often allow you to sort of, with some probability, predict effectively what term might precede or go after a certain other term. Effectively look at word relationships. The context and pattern associations of terms helps to inform on the expected term and that categorization of that term. So once you identify a term, so race in this case, you may then use a more general category to classify that term. If you go too specific, that classification is too specific, you may not really understand much of your data. But if you categorize it at a somewhat general level, then you begin to see larger patterns of information that might be quite useful. And that's hopefully what I'll show you in a second. So let's go back to the eBay problem. So eBay, as I mentioned, is a semi-structured data set effectively. You have structured data like price and location. So price and location here is basically structured. It's really easy to scrape that information, and you know exactly where to go on the site and you get that information. But these descriptions, as I mentioned, have a lot of valuable information. So the information that I was interested in is one, the kind of culture that's being sold, two, the cultural object, the type of object, so jewelry, those kinds of things, necklaces, etc., or perhaps household goods or general tools, weapons, those kinds of things. But also the materiality of the object, so metals in many cases, glass, bone, etc., wood, those kinds of things as well. I want to know what kind of materials were being sold on eBay. So these are where you have to basically categorize those terms. So what NER does is basically look at this description and then classify and gives you these outputs. So you might see terms like Viking. Okay, this is a Viking culture. Jewelry, so maybe we'll find ring. So it'll classify as a kind of jewelry. And then it'll say bronze ring. So that context will tell it it's a form of metal. So that categorization. So effectively using a simple description, very short description, you have three key identifiers in relation to an object being sold, with addition to the actual location and price of that object that's being sold. So you have effectively 5 sets of data from a fairly short description with some structured information presented. Okay, so with any kind of information science approach, you really want to apply some validation to what you're doing, of course. So we also look back at the data set itself. So once you run the algorithm, you get an output, and you want to effectively randomly sample that output to see how effective it was or how good it was in identifying those cultures, the objects, and materiality of those objects. So we did some precision tests, some other forms of information retrieval tests, precision recall tests. These are fairly good values, 0.94, 0.91 for precision and PPV. So that tells me that this is, at least for now, a fairly good way to go. It can, of course, be trained, hopefully, in the future to get even better. But in terms of, for these purposes, I think it's generally a good result. So the analysis itself involved basically a kind of macro level analysis where we looked at the wider body of data, the 54,000 plus worth of sales, but also country-specific data, and I'll talk about that in a second. So at the macro level, Roman culture sells more than anything else by far. Egyptian culture was number 2, seller on eBay. Unknown, that is, cultures without any clear categorization, were number 3. And then Viking, and then Near Eastern cultures was number 5. And you can see the kinds of, these are representations, box whisker diagrams, of different sales of different types of objects. So for instance, Roman objects often deal with metals and jewelry, very commonly. Egyptian objects often deal with terracotta objects and statues, which also includes things like sort of small figurines. So statues is kind of a general category I use for figurines and larger statues. Viking objects also dealt with a lot of metals and jewelry. Near Eastern objects dealt with things like texts, and leather goods were quite high valued, for instance, but also clothing was also fairly prominent in cases, and a lot of unknown objects as well, meaning that they had no clear categorization, were also fairly well valued. So you can see that different cultures sometimes have different forms of objects of interest, and their materiality can be quite different, particularly with Egyptian objects, which were really different from everything else. And you can do the macro study. You can see which countries, of course, sell antiquities more than anyone else, and not surprising, Britain's right at the top by far, basically on more than 3 times the nearest competitor almost, or about 3 times. and Thailand is actually surprisingly number 3. I think Cyprus was 4, and Germany was number 5 in terms of the top 5 countries where objects were being sold. And Britain, this is about $1 million worth of sales between October and April, I guess. So just a few months worth of sale data. And you can see when you map all these sale data for the entire time, 54,000, you get a kind of sort of power law relationship, but also an exponential relationship there in the end. So kind of mixed bag there in terms of what follows. Very few high-priced goods. I think they're the highest selling things about $6,000. But a lot of really cheap stuff gets sold on eBay, which maybe because a lot of it's fake too. But anyways, you do find some cheap stuff that's also obviously sold there. Right, so breaking it down to more specifically the country level data. If you look at things like where objects are sold, you can see, for instance, Roman objects, as I mentioned, have a kind of wide sale area. They sell everywhere. Not surprising, Britain sells more Roman objects than anyone else. You can see things like there are some kind of spatial patterns going on. So in Northern Europe and also Eastern Europe, you get a lot of Viking, what's called Viking cultures that are being sold. You get some Islamic cultures in the Northern Africa, Near Eastern regions. Sometimes you get weird patterns, like Islamic cultures selling a lot in Spain, for instance, or probably unexpected patterns, I should say. Renaissance selling in Italy, for instance. So this is kind of color-coded to show you the different cultures and where they sell. You do get surprises. For instance, Greek cultural objects sell a lot in Iran, apparently. A lot of unknown objects, both in China and in North America, in the United States particularly. So objects where we don't quite can tell what cultures are really being sold very obviously. So those are some of the other patterns that were noticed. Another interesting way to look at it is also breaking down the results by types of objects. So texts, so we know Britain is the #1 seller for most types of objects, but when you look at it more broken down into different categories, Britain is still #1 in text, but the United States is much closer. Coins, both the United States and Britain again, are leaders. Jewelry as well, but Thailand plays a very much important role. And also in statues and figurines, again, Britain leading the way. But in terms of glass, Canada is actually #1 seller of glass-based objects, apparently. So that was one sort of interesting result. France plays a very important role in selling metal-based objects on eBay, whereas terracotta, Egypt was #1 seller of terracotta-based objects. And that was not surprising because they were, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Egyptian antiquities, they tend to be terracotta-based, whereas other cultures, they tend to be more metal-based. So it's one of those sort of exceptions. A lot of faience, those kinds of things being sold on eBay, for instance. So Egypt being the sort of key market, if you will, for that, or key seller, I should say. What if you look at specific cultures, break it down by cultures? So in terms of Near Eastern cultures, being someone who works in the Near East, I was very much curious to see who sells Near Eastern cultures more than anyone else. And Britain is also #1 in that, with the United States not too far away. And as I mentioned, sometimes cultures map to the regions in which they originate or are more likely to be encountered. So Buddhist-related cultures was my general categorization. Thailand was #1 for selling that, whereas Germany sold a lot of Central Asian cultures. And in Britain, again, as I mentioned, Roman cultures were obviously quite prominent. Now, what about how objects relate to each other? Correlations between different types of objects was one way I wanted to see. So if you're selling different kinds of objects, for instance, jewelry, those kinds of things, which countries correlate well with those kind of objects? So we find a number of correlations, for instance. Egyptian, Greek, and Viking objects, they tend to relate to things like vessels, jewelry, clothing, household, and religious objects. So those tend to have a strong correlation between those cultures and those forms of objects that are being sold. Renaissance and American cultural objects, so of the Americas, a very general category I created for the Americas, which was sort of for the entire continent, really, or the two continents. They have a strong relationship to portraits and paintings, so not surprisingly, a lot of those, perhaps Renaissance cultures in particular, paintings and portraits are very commonly sold in relation to that. And for the Indus region, vessels and jewelry, again, similar to the Near East and Greek and other cultures, you see a lot of vessels and jewelry being more typical for that area. And just applying the principal component analysis, just look at how objects, again, relate in terms of sales. Islamic and weapons are often very closely associated in sort of the principal component space. Vikings, and tools, coins, and stones, again, somewhat related, close in space to each other. Okay, so in terms of the methods, classification, machine learning techniques, I think, help us to make sense of these larger data sets. We can track now also in real time this information, so we can begin to know what's happening in eBay as it's changing and other sites. So I think this is a good example of where this works. Buyer data, certainly not. Obviously, lots of data issues there. So that's something that we are not doing. And we begin to understand, of course, regions that sell objects, how they're sort of consuming this information or consuming those kind of cultural objects. Notable patterns indicate what objects are of high demand in these regions, as I mentioned, some of the ones in the talk. So the tool has been released. Obviously, I'm always updating it, but that's pretty much it. So thanks for listening.